Good morning, friends. This is Charles McCall again, and I have a thought to share with you this morning. One of the young men from our church here in Phnom Penh sent me a text message this morning, and he said, Pastor, he actually said, Dear handsome pastor, can you explain this verse to me? It is 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. In the New King James Version of the Bible, it says, For we dare not class ourselves or compare ourselves with those who commend themselves, but they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. And so my answer to Vachanuk this morning was, first of all, to understand any one verse, you have to understand the context of that verse. And so when you look at one verse and you wonder what it means, or you want an accurate understanding of what it means, you have to read the verses before it and the verses after it. And so the first thing I did is read the verses before it, verse 12, and the verse after. I read verse 11, and then I read verses 13 and 14 to try to understand the context or the situation of that particular verse. The verses before and the verse after can help explain. And then from there, we also need to understand, the verse context, and we also understand the chapter context. So the next thing is we go back to the chapter. And so what's this whole chapter 10 about anyway? And can what is said in chapter 10 give me clearer understanding on verse 12? And so I went back and I read the entire chapter. And so we understand the verse context, we understand the chapter context, and then we understand the entire book context. So by the way, what's 2 Corinthians all about anyway? And so this helps us to understand the meaning of the writer of any one particular verse. And so in 2 Corinthians is a very personal letter of the Apostle Paul, and Paul really is writing to defend himself. Paul planted the church in Corinth, and he stayed there, I think, for 18 months, it says in the book of Acts. And he developed the church, he grew the church, he was the spiritual father. Then he turned it over to someone else, and he moved on to other locations. And so during the passing of time, other people had come into the church. And traveling preachers and prophets and apostles, guest speakers would come into the church. And so the church members began to compare Paul with these other guys. Man, these other guys are better speaker than Paul's. They communicate better. They're more handsome than Paul is. He's kind of short and has a big nose from what history tells us. And so they started comparing and started looking at these other guys and not really giving the honor or respect that they should give to their spiritual father. And so the entire book of 2 Corinthians is Paul's defense. He writes back to them and he says, I'm really hurt by you guys and how you've treated me. And so Paul's defense is his sacrifices. He said, I don't want to boast. He said that several times. I don't want to be proud, but if I can just point out to you, I've suffered a lot for you guys. I've sacrificed a lot for you guys. And so now here you are looking at these new guys coming through, and they're popular and they dress nice and maybe they have money or whatever. And so I just want to really encourage you. I think you're thinking the wrong way. Be careful about being persuaded by these guys that are just passing through and who are not truly your spiritual fathers. In fact, I think it's in this book, he says, you have many teachers, thousands of teachers, but you only have one spiritual father, so think about that. And so in this particular verse, that's the book context, and then the chapter context and the verse context of this verse. Paul is saying, when we talk about comparing, be careful about comparing yourself with other people. And he said, these guys, I don't compare myself with them. In fact, it goes on, and he said, I don't compare myself with anybody. I don't compare myself with these other guys and think, oh, I feel bad because now they're getting the glory, they're getting the honor and recognition, and they have things better off. They didn't sacrifice like me. He says, I don't compare myself to guys like that.